What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Bootleg Studios of Rant Roller Sports. In this video, I'm going to attempt to describe why when most GOAT comparisons are made and the top, 50 NBA players list and top 25 guys are named, why a lot of the older guys shouldn't be on the list. I mean, guys that played in the 50s and some guys that played in the 60s shouldn't be on the list. And this is one of the best videos. This video made by this guy who said he watched a game from every decade to present. So that means he watched the game from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the 2010s up until now. And he does a great job of highlighting some skill differences, the way the game was coached, the way coaches would coach the game in different time periods, and also how the game is refereed, along with a little bit of some athleticism differences. Although that's kind of harder to quantify because you had great athletes, I feel, in every decade, but definitely the skill level, ball handling and shooting evolved at a very fast rate between the 50s and today.
The 1950 season. The style of basketball back then was very different than it is now. For example, look at how the majority of players shot free throws. But beyond just that, the gameplay itself was also very different. The Pistons-Knicks game started out...
I believe that somebody told Wilt Chamberlain, I believe it was Rick Barry, started coaching Wilt Chamberlain into shooting free throws underhanded, and his free throw percentage actually improved.
About as sloppy as possible, with a combined 5 turnovers before a single field goal attempt had been taken by either team. When the ball wasn't being turned over, shot selection was erratic. Despite there being no three-point line, players would fire up 30-foot two-point jumpers at the basket. And you can see why the league average field goal percentage was just 34% back in 1950. No team in the NBA...
Did you hear what he said? The league average field goal percentage was 34%. Holy smokes. And you wonder how a guy could average 20 to 25 rebounds a season? You start with the field goal percentages.
They shot above 40% from the field that season. The most popular type of shooting form during the game was the set shot, meaning instead of shooting what we now call a jump shot, players would plant 2 feet on the ground and almost chest pass the ball up to the hoop with 2 hands. The next most common way of shooting the ball was the 1-foot runner, jumping off,
which is still used greatly today, the runner or the floater,
off of 1 foot and shooting what we now usually call a float. But at one point in the game, there was one particular shot that stood out to me as something closer to what we might see nowadays. Watch how the player rips through and dribbles to his left.
That looked like a modern move right there.
Before rising up for a jumper. It's closer to the technique we'd see today from someone taking a mid-range pull-up. There were also tons and tons of hook shots from the Knicks and Pistons. Sky hooks, running hooks, baby hooks, you name it, and this game had it. As soon as the ball went inside, the post player was looking to get to his hook shot, even if it meant taking one from 10 to 15 feet out. Later in the video, I'll show you how post play has evolved over time, but at this point, it was all about the hook shot. Had social media been around in 1950, passing was the one area of the game that would have made for some
that was a
legitimate
beautiful
highlight
pass.
games. I was surprised at how many flashy passes the game had, like no-look passes or behind the backs. And that passing was especially on display when the Knicks and Pistons were running the fast break. Because the court was so clogged in half-court situations, getting out in transition seemed to be the best option for creating efficient looks. X's and O's wise, there wasn't a whole lot to analyze back in the 50s. But the primary half-court offense was a dribble weave, with the players handing the ball off to each other back and forth on the perimeter. By the way, the weave is still used by teams today as an entry into different set plays. Offenses will now start a possession with a weave out on the top, get the defense moving or distracted, and then flow into another action.
But the difference is the ball went up for an alley-oop, which they weren't doing that. That wasn't part of that weave action in the 50s.
There was no shot clock back in 1950, so the weave theoretically could be infinite, lasting as long as necessary for the defense to break down. But that wasn't really the case until the Knicks went up late in the game. Only in the fourth quarter did they begin wasting time by repetitively moving the ball out.
See, being that there's no shot clock in this era, it definitely influences the offense because there's no pressure and to force up a quick shot. So these guys were running actions to get the best shot that they thought available at the time.
Out on the perimeter. The 24-second shot clock would eventually be implemented 4 years later in 1954, which leads us into the 1960s, a decade that was dominated by Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics. For the rest of the video, every game selected is from the NBA Finals, starting with the 1963 Finals between the Celtics and Lakers.
Now this is where I get into a lot of arguments on my channel in the comment section, friendly debates, I would say, where I say that Wilt Chamberlain's numbers are inflated because of 4 poor field goal percentages and just a whole lot of unskilled guys shooting the basketball. The same way Bill Russell wouldn't be blocking 10 shots a game today. The skill level was different, and this video is going to highlight this.
Watching these historical games, expecting to see a very controlled and disciplined style of play. We always hear how basketball used to be more of a team game, with fundamental passing involvement. But the 63 Finals was surprisingly frenetic. Celtics head coach Red Auerbach was known for introducing the fast break into the game of basketball, but both teams played very fast and at times a little reckless. Just watch this sequence during the first half, which featured one fast break after another, neither team interested in slowing the ball down. In fact, I started noticing there were a lot of possessions where the Lakers or Celtics made 0 passes before taking a shot. Unlike what we're usually led to believe about old school basketball, this game from 63 didn't feature.
Now, what you can already see from the 50s and 60s is that the art of jump shooting has evolved. The science of jump shooting has evolved. So clearly here, we're still in the developmental stages of the jump shot. So therefore, you have a whole lot of misses, which leads to a whole lot of rebounds.
A lot of passing, and instead had quite a bit of one-on-one play. Another narrative we often hear about the 60s is that players couldn't, or at least didn't, dribble with their left hands. We've all seen those videos of guys awkwardly moving to their left while dribbling with their right hand. To test that narrative, I charted every single dribble from the first quarter of this game. In total, the Lakers and Celtics combined for 280 dribbles in the front court. 219 of those were right-handed dribbles, or 78%. That sounds like a lot, but I wanted something to...
All I heard growing up in the 80s from my father and all the old school guys, young man, you got to learn that left hand. If you were right-handed, you got to learn to dribble with your left hand. That offhand, you got to develop the left. And if you was left-handed, you will automatically in life develop in your right hand because we live in a right-hand dominant society. So if you were right-handed growing up, that's all you heard. Develop that left, young bro.
Compare it to, so I picked a Lakers-Celtics game from this season in 2022. In the first quarter of that game, the teams combined for 278 dribbles, a similar amount of total dribbles. But now, just 55% of those were with the right hand.
Now, this is one of the most telling stats he put together, and this is very well done. Now you see the percentage shifted from almost about 25% of the time dribbling with your right hand, with your left hand, to now bringing it up to almost 50%, 50-50, developing that left.
A pretty significant difference that supports the narrative that players in the 60s were less skilled as ball handlers. Back to the game now. As you'd expect, Bill Russell was a difference maker defensively. He blocked shots and protected the paint all game long for the Celtics. But besides from shooting a couple skyhooks per quarter, he was more of a role player offensively. The biggest difference between the 60s and today was spacing. The game was played with a packed paint, making it very hard for the offense to generate open shots. Watch the spacing on the ball screen here. The handler dribbles right into his teammate in the post, giving him nowhere to go. Same thing on this
During these times too, the basketball was heavily controlled by coaches, which ran a lot of robotic plays and didn't allow for as much free space and creativity as today's players.
pick and pop. The players are spaced on top of each other. The game was officiated differently as well. Referees were much quicker to call traveling violations. Nowadays, players are given much more leeway when catching the ball on the move or bobbling a pass. But in the 60s,
if that's the case, James Harden would be called for traveling 20 times a game, to the point where he wouldn't even be playable.
Any even slightly awkward movement was usually called a travel. The game was also not nearly as physical, with referees calling fouls as soon as any type of contact was initiated. Offensive fouls were especially different. The defensive player didn't need to be set or to fall down to take a charge. If the offensive player initiated contact, it was called an offensive foul.
Look how soft and weak that style of play was. You know, the old school guys are always talking about how tough the game was. Not in the 60s.
From an X's and O's perspective, one of the Celtics' favorite concepts was scissor action. They would bring Bill Russell out to the foul line and then have their guards cut off of him like in the shape of the scissors. It's another concept still used by teams today. And speaking of concepts still used today, the Celtics also initiated offense using pistol action, with guards handing the ball off to each other and setting a screen out on the wing. Many years later, that action would be one of the...
But as you can see, the offense is stretched out to the three-point line, thus giving superior spacing.
primary options in Mike D'Antoni's revolutionary 7 seconds or less offense with the Phoenix Suns. Next up, we skip ahead to the 1977 finals between Dr. J's Philadelphia 76ers and Bill Walton's Portland Trailblazers, a series that was won by the Blazers. The game is starting to get more modern. I mean, we even have a nice flop from Lloyd B. Free while trying to take a charge. Or as the announcers called it, an acting job. Let's recap the state of the game.
So the flop is nothing new.
We saw that jump shooting form was pretty ugly in the 50s, in the games from the 50s and 60s. There was this Bill Russell putback dunk off of an offensive rebound, but that's about it. That's now changed in the 70s as well. On one of the first plays of the game, Bill Walton rolled to the basket and dunked on Dr. J. In general, the Blazers-Sixers game was played above the rim, with alley-oops and players catching bodies.
So as you can see in the 70s, the game is starting to become more forceful and more athletic, along with a little bit more creativity offensively.
These called a tight game in the 50s and 60s, leading to less physical play. That's still largely the case in the 70s. For example, with the 76ers losing, Henry Bibby tried to jumpstart a comeback by pressuring the Blazers ball handlers to create a steal, only to be called for 3 ticky-tack reach-in fouls in a row. One area that's still lagging behind in the 70s is ball handling. Consider a superstar player like Julius Erving. Obviously, he's one of the best dunkers in NBA history. He had the body type of a modern big wing like a Jason Tatum or Paul George. He hit tough, contested fadeaway jumpers all game long against the Bulls.
Although I will say, using Dr. J as a ball handling example in the 70s is not entirely accurate. You would have to go more toward Tiny Archibald, Walt Clyde Frazier, and of course, God, the guy from the Bullets. God, I forgot his name. It'll come to me. But there were other ball handlers, Pistol Pete Mavericks, that were superior to Dr. J.
Blazers, excelling as the Sixers' go-to guy in isolation situations.
Earl of Pearl Monroe.
But the area of his game that didn't quite line up with modern NBA wings was his ball handle. He largely played with his back to the basket, backing his man down and shooting over the defense instead of relying on quick dribble moves or crossovers. The biggest improvement man is trailing him and then curls the screen to get all the way to the basket. Both the 76ers and Blazers used off-ball cutting and screening to free up players for open shots. The on-ball screen wasn't nearly as big of a part of the game as it is nowadays, but motion offenses were beginning to be developed that relied heavily on off-ball screens. We'll see even more of that in the 80s from Larry Bird and the Celtics.
But you'll notice that they still don't have the great spacing that superior three-point shooting provides today's players.
The Blazers used their center, Bill Walton, to initiate that motion offense. Walton would catch the ball around the elbow area and then act as the distributor, looking for his teammates cutting on the weak side. That's very different from anything we've seen so far. Remember, the post players we saw in the 60s were all about the hook shot. Their offensive responsibilities started and ended with the ability to score off hooks. But for Walton, his passing ability allowed him to have more responsibility within the offense, playing away from the basket and looking to pass with shades of how someone like Jokic plays today.
The difference being Joel Embiid and Jokic can stretch the floor to the three-point line, thus once again making superior cutting, driving, and spacing.
Defensively, Walton was sensational. The Blazers essentially played a one-man zone. Walton would roam around the paint and block or at the very least disrupt nearly every Sixers shot attempt. Watch here how he double teams Dr. J when the ball goes in the post. And on this ball screen, Walton is essentially playing what we now call drop coverage, years before drop coverage was ever formally named. Walton's size and athleticism combined with the Blazers' defensive game plan were...
Right there, the Blazers were basically playing zone, which would be illegal a few years later.
Too much for the 76ers. The 80s were again dominated by the Celtics and Lakers, so now we head to the middle of the decade.
This is my era. I'm 10 years old at this point. This is my early years enjoying the game of basketball. Of course, I was a Laker fan, led by Magic Johnson.
For the 85 finals. The first thing that stands out is there's now a three-point line on the court. The Lakers even have 4 players spaced around it in this frame. Very different spacing from previous decades. But this freeze frame is actually very misleading.
Also, look how much larger the players are from the 50s. That's one thing you can see right away, the size difference.
Neither team consistently spaced out to the three-point line, even though it was now on the court. This shot was actually the only made three-pointer in the entire game, and it came because the Celtics desperately started shooting threes at the end of the fourth quarter. Instead, spacing usually looked like this, with 2 big men occupying the blocks. On the entry into the post, Magic Johnson double teams, and just watch the Celtics positioning on the weak side. Pretty much as if the three-point line doesn't exist.
Now, they gave up 2 wide open shots on the perimeter for Larry Bird, if you notice.
Because the Celtics desperately started shooting threes at the end of the fourth quarter.
Which, in today's game, he would have shot the ball.
Usually looked like this, with 2 big men occupying the blocks. On the entry into the post, Magic
right here,
Johnson
Bird is
double
open for the
teams,
3.
And just watch the Celtics
Twice he was
positioning
open.
on the
He still
weak
gives
side.
it up
Pretty much as if the
for a
three-point
corner
line doesn't
2 that is not even a 3. In today's more efficient offenses, Danny Ainge would be all the way in the corner for that corner 3, which would be the more efficient shot.
exist. Even Larry Bird, one of the best shooters in NBA history, had little interest in taking open threes during this game.
Well, he wasn't open right there.
The Celtics' offense centered around floppy action. 2 bigs would start out on the block, while 2 guards would start below them on the baseline, coming off screens set by the bigs. Bird made a living using those screens to get open for shots. On this play, he comes off the screen and misses.
In today's game, he would have curled all the way out beyond the three-point line and taken that three-point shot. That's the main difference between today in that era.
Is the mid-range jumper, but here he uses the screen to pump fake and get all the way to the hoop. And on this example, both Lakers defenders go to Bird, so Robert Parrish is left open on the inside. The guards could also interact with each other and switch places on the baseline, adding another layer for the defense to react to. Here's an example of that. The guards switch and Bird is left alone in the paint. However, the majority of the time the Celtics ran floppy, they were looking to feed the post. Bird, or whichever player received the screen.
Now, three guys collapsed on Robert Parrish there, and he could have easily swung the ball right back out to Bird for an open three. That's today's game.
However, the majority of the time the Celtics ran floppy,
Watch
they
this.
were looking to feed the post. Bird,
The ball
or
should come right
whichever
back
player
out, but it
received the
doesn't.
Screen would then look to get the ball inside to Parrish and Kevin McHale. Watch how the defender is fronting the post here, which sets up a lob right over the top into Parrish. On the other hand,
So I want to highlight there a lot of old school guys claiming new school basketball, doesn't compare, doesn't stack up. New school basketball is actually more efficient than old school basketball because they're using the entire court. The entire half court. When you have guys like Steph Curry and Dame Lillard that can shoot the shot and make it from half court, you have to come all the way out and guard that shot now. Big difference.
And the Lakers also played with two big men on the blocks, but their primary action was the cross screen. Early in the possession, the big on the strong side block would go set a screen for the big on the weak side block looking to get a paint touch. The Lakers would flow right into that cross screen for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and James Worthy as soon as the ball crossed half court. On this cross screen, watch how the Celtics defended.
If you notice, look right there. Look how many players are collapsed down into the paint. No emphasis in these days. They didn't emphasize guarding the three-point shot, and they didn't emphasize taking the three-point shot.
Double team the post with the passer's men, completely sagging off of Magic. Both teams played that sagging defense all game long. Instead of picking the ball up past the three-point line and pressuring it, the Celtics and Lakers...
Right there, in today's game, as soon as they collapse on Kareem in the post, Magic was supposed to slide out for that corner three shot. That's the difference in today's game versus back then.
Dropped way back and dared the handler to take a shot. Because no offensive player had any interest in keeping the defense honest by taking a pull-up three, the strategy...
Right there, DJ is supposed to pop back to the wing for that corner three. That's an easy three-point shot in today's game.
Was an effective way to double team the post. It created a cat and mouse game where the offense would awkwardly...
Thus, it's much harder to play defense in today's game.
Try to feed the post while the player guarding the ball was trying to be in two places at once.
Again, look at this. Now, of course, you're going to say, well, Rant, Magic wasn't a great three-point shooter. It doesn't matter. He developed a three-point shot right around 28, 29 years old where he could make them somewhere around 30%. And that's all you need is the threat of being able to make that shot at least 30% of the time. And that would stop all of this constant trapping of the post.
Sometimes that cat and mouse game would result in the post player and ball handler just passing the ball back and forth to each other multiple times. Obviously, the worse the shooter, the farther back the defender would go away from the ball. But even a sharpshooter like Larry Bird...
Even right here, that's McHale. So, of course, the defense is going to collapse on him in the post. Danny Ainge should have fed the post and popped back out beyond the three-point line or stayed behind the three-point line, feeding the post, waiting for the pass back out.
Was given space when he had the ball. It's pretty jarring.
Instead, he settled for a bad two right there.
Obviously, the worse the shooter, the farther back the defender would go away
Here,
from
watch
the
the
ball.
sequence
but even
again.
A sharpshooter like Larry Bird was given space when he had the ball. It's pretty jarring to see no pressure being applied to the ball and everyone being dared to shoot. It also directly contrasts the ideas that the hand-checking...
Right there again, Bird should have swung that ball over to DJ at the top of the three-point line. The defense probably would have swung back over, but DJ would have swung the ball back.
To each other multiple times. Obviously, the worse the shooter, the farther back the defender would go away from the ball. But even a sharpshooter like Larry Bird was given space when he had the ball. It's pretty jarring to see no
the
pressure
sequence
being
right here. The
applied
ball
to
should
ball
swing over to
everyone
DJ.
being dared to shoot. It also directly contrasts the ideas that the hand-checking rules in the 80s and 90s made it more difficult to score back then. In the 85 finals, it didn't really matter what the rules were at all. The player guarding the ball was positioned too far back to hand check, even if he wanted to. Of course, there's a reason they play defense like that. Guarding dominant post players like Kareem and McHale wasn't easy. Kareem started the game 7 for 7 and had 5 skyhooks. Given how crowded the paint was during Kareem's career, it kind of makes sense that he developed a signature.
And Kareem scored all these points without the benefit of spacing from a three-point line. He was truly one of the GOATs, if not the GOAT, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Shot that was nearly unblockable no matter where defenders were positioned. Meanwhile, McHale had even better numbers. He finished with 32 points and 16 rebounds despite the
even though he made that shot.
Nearly unblockable no
Look
matter
how
where
open
defenders were positioned. Meanwhile,
the shooter
McHale
was.
had even better numbers.
Right
He
here,
finished
watch
with
this.
32 points
Look
and
how
16
open
rebounds
Danny Ainge is.
despite the double teams. But it was the Lakers that went on to win the title.
Of course they would, because the Lakers are the best.
On now to the 1998 finals. The three-point line's now a little bit more prevalent.
This is where basketball started taking a downward spiral, which the controllers of the game had to do something about this era. Right around this era to about 2004, 2005, was a horrible period for the NBA fans to watch because the ball was stagnant. It was very little offensive skill being shown or displayed other than your superstars playing iso ball.
Michael Jordan started out Game 6 by hitting 3 threes in just the first half. Here, Dennis Rodman screens for the MJ three-pointer while Tony Kukoc is coming off of an empty ball screen. And on this one, the Bulls go to their split action out of the triangle offense. It actually wasn't the only time they hit a 3 off of the split. Kukoc hit a big one in the fourth quarter. The Jazz even hit a pull-up 3 in transition with no one.
As you can see here in 98, the spacing is, of course, has gotten better because the three-point shot is more utilized.
Picking up the ball, Jeff Hornacek let it fly from downtown. All that being said, there were still only 6 combined three-pointers made by the two teams. Nowhere near the amounts we see nowadays. And when guarding the ball, the pickup points were still very low like we saw in the 80s. Here, John Stockton has the ball. He was a very respectable 38% three-point shooter for his career.
John Stockton not taking more open threes is the reason why the Jazz would never win the championship. It's not his fault. A lot of it was the coaching of Jerry Sloan, which was very strict, but also it was just that era. Point guards were not jacking up three-point shots on a regular basis.
But the Bulls still sag off of him and dare him to shoot regardless. With
Stockton could have easily pulled up right hand in Ron Harper's face and make at least 4 or 5 of these threes every game if he chose to, but that just wasn't how the game was played.
Stockton showing no real interest in pulling the trigger. Besides from his three-point shooting, Michael Jordan did his best work in the post. He nailed a fadeaway jumper over his left shoulder, buried another fadeaway over...
So anyway, folks, I'll make a part 2 to this, so this is not a super long video. I just want to highlight the fact that a lot of people are nostalgic about the eras that they grew up in and how... and they don't realize the evolution of the game. And in this video, it highlighted a lot of the game's evolution. And I'll make a part 2 to this video where we'll get into the next era of LeBron and Kobe and Tim Duncan, Dirk Nowitzki, and so on and so forth. This has been Rant Roller Sports. Part 2 coming.